everyone. Apologies for the delay, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Peggy Lee. I'm the Director of Chapters, and I'm based out of Houston, Texas. I use she, her pronouns. As you may know, ACS made the difficult decision to cancel our student convention at Harvard Law School, and we moved a number of our original substantive programs into virtual series. So as a quick note, we have some events coming up next week after this one. So there's a small group networking session with Justin Hansford from Howard University. He's the executive director at Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. And then that's on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And then on Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern, we'll be hosting a program titled The Degradation of Democracy and the Courts with Professor Michael Klerman from Harvard Law School. So you can find all of this on our 2020 ACS Student Convention website. So logistics. All of the attendees are currently on mute. If you have a question, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout, please type them into your Q&A box. Alternatively, if you're dialing in by phone, you can email them to me at campus@acslaw.org. Again, that's campus@acslaw.org. There will be a Q&A session at the end. So now I'm going to introduce our fantastic moderator for this panel entitled Innovations in Local Leadership, and that's John Miller. He is the legal director of the Public Rights Project, a nonprofit organization that partners with state and local government offices around the country to catalyze equitable enforcement and impact affirmative litigation in support of vulnerable populations. Before joining PRP, Mr. Miller served as chief of the Public Protection and Advocacy Bureau in the Massachusetts AG's office. And more recently, some of the litigation work that he's worked on include overseeing Massachusetts cases challenging the travel ban and the termination of the DACA program. John received his JD from Columbia Law School. So John, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Peggy. And welcome everyone for joining us. We're so appreciative that you made some time this afternoon to join us for this discussion, and very excited to be joined here by Mayor Siddiqui and Mayor Lumumba to talk a little bit about local innovation, and particularly focusing in this moment around what's happening in local government in response to COVID-19 and many of the economic challenges that are facing these communities right now. I'm going to begin with a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we'll just jump into some questions. And as Peggy mentioned, we'll have lots of time for question and answers at the end. We can also take your questions on the function here on Zoom, and try to answer any sort of topical ones as we go through our conversation. So welcome again to everybody, and many thanks to ACS for convening us today on these really important issues. Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui is currently serving her second term on the Cambridge City Council, and first as mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts. She grew up in Cambridge, attended Cambridge Public Schools, graduating from Cambridge Ridge in Latin. Mayor Siddiqui's passion for local activism and service motivated her to co-found the Cambridge Youth Council, now in its 17th year. After she graduated with a bachelor's degree in public policy from Brown University, Mayor Siddiqui served as an AmeriCorps Fellow working to improve social mobility for families. She earned her JD from Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law. And she moved back to Boston, the Boston area, as a legal aid lawyer with Northeast Legal Aid, serving the communities of Lawrence, Lynn, and Lowell, Massachusetts. Also joining us, Mayor Chokwe Antar Lumumba, who has been the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi since 2017. He began his community work early in his life, serving as co-director of the Malcolm X Grassroots Day Camp. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Tuskegee University, and then earned a JD from Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University. After law school, he returned to Jackson, Mississippi, and began his work as a junior associate at Lumumba, Freelon & Associates. Within a year, he became a managing attorney there. And then in 2013, he launched his own firm, Lumumba & Associates, a firm dedicated to community invested in justice. A founding member of the Mississippi Human Rights Collective, he co-organized the Stand Up to Take It Down rally at the state capitol to support the removal of the Confederate insignia the Mississippi state flag. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Siddiqui and Mayor Lumumba. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think to just start us off, I think we're both really curious to hear a little bit about, what sort of day-to-day things look like as a mayor right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done to adapt, to the situation on the ground and the COVID-19 pandemic that is challenging all of our communities right now? And why don't we start with Mayor Lumumba?
Okay. Well, let me start by thanking ACS for having me. I regret, as I'm sure everyone does, that we're not able to have this discussion in person. But I hope that somewhere in the near future, we will have the occasion to meet face to face. But be that as it may, I'm still grateful that we can have this conversation. And I'm looking forward to the questions that the students have because I so enjoy that dialogue. So, this is a very unique time where, there's a lot of, it's a fluid situation first and foremost, but there are a lot of questions, concerns, and fears associated with those concerns based on this global pandemic. And so what I believe is most important out of leadership at this moment is that not only we provide brutal honesty to the people, but that we also provide a rational basis for hope. Just ensuring to the people that we do all that we can, that we're taking the most progressive measures. That has required, in the absence of maybe a decision for the leadership and decisions to come from the top down that gives uniform policy, it has required mayors all across the country to make decisions independent of states and often independent of the nation and often independent of states. That has been the circumstance to some great extent here in Jackson, Mississippi. For those of you that are not familiar with Jackson, maybe have not had the occasion to travel here, Jackson is the capital of the state of Mississippi. It also is the most dense population. The city of Jackson is 3 times the size of the next largest city. And not only are we the capital of the state, we, for all intensive purposes, we are the capital of healthcare. And so it's very critical that the strategy for the state really incorporate a decision-making process with the leadership here. And unfortunately, that has not taken place. It has, what I have witnessed is, several days of trying to call the governor, get in contact with him, and unable to do so. But, as I share with people on a normal occasion, if your plan for success is dependent on someone else to act on your behalf, then you really don't have a plan. You have a wish list. And so we've taken this matter in our own hands. In fact, as early as January 31st, I actually had a scheduled trip to China for a business meeting for the city for business opportunities. And quite naturally, that was canceled in light of the pandemic. And some of the organizers of that event asked that I do a plea to our medical providers for them to provide medical equipment, masks and gloves, because China was seeing the first rendition of this pandemic. And so we did so. So we were actually one of the early administrations to address this in any way whatsoever. And then seeing the trends, while we are people of faith, we have no reason to believe that the Lord somehow carved Jackson out of the rest of the globe and that we weren't going to suffer the challenges of this pandemic. And so we placed in restrictive measures, closing bars and restaurants, limiting gatherings to 10 people. And as numbers began to increase and CDC recommendations evolved, we ultimately landed on a stay-at-home order. So that's where we are now. One of the significant challenges is the question of how do we ensure, to the best of our ability, the safety of our residents based on this pandemic while simultaneously operating an economy in the presence of COVID-19. And that presents many challenges, not only in terms of the hardship, the disproportionate effect that COVID-19 has, not only in terms of medical treatment and those that suffer at the hands of this virus, and disproportionately what we have seen is that Black communities have suffered, or communities of color have disproportionately suffered the ill effects of that. And I think that that's more a reflection of our healthcare system. Our healthcare system has witnessed these disparities for all of time, essentially, or at least the history of our nation. And I think that if the fight for the right to vote was the battle of the 20th century, then the fight for equal access to healthcare should be the fight of the 21st century. And so what this is truly exposing, and I'll get into some finer points of what we are doing, but I'm more or less giving an overview of what this feels like. I think that there's little difference between a nation that may not have the medical advancement to provide the care that people need, and a nation that has every advancement, but putting profits over people fails to do so. And so I think that we are looking at the conscience of our nation right now. And I think that many of the things, many of the discussions that have been waged in a lot of political settings now bears out that this is truly affecting us in a way that we have never imagined. But it affects people on a day-to-day basis with so many underlying health conditions that are unable to have access as they need it. And so what we are doing as a city, not only have we put those restrictive orders in place, because we are failing to have the cooperation of the state, we have purchased our own test. We have purchased some 6,000 tests that we are utilizing not only to test a percentage of the population that is consistent with what the data is showing that the percentage of most cities' affected population is. So we're able to utilize those tests for that purpose. We're testing first responders because they invariably come into contact with people more than the average person. We are providing hazard pay to those first responders in this time of need. We have also entered an agreement with one of our hotels so that we can provide safe harbor for anyone who is infected and either does not have a place to lay their head if they are not in need of hospitalization. So we have purchased rooms so that we can give them, kind of a convalescent home, some place where they can rest, where they can get better. We have a meal program which we call Jackson Meals Matter, where we have been distributing meals to homes and to children who quite honestly depend on the food that they get during school hours, and normally that's the nourishment, unfortunately, that they would receive. And so we're delivering meals to them, and just trying to do a coordinated response. We have purchased what we call a symptom collector, and what we are doing is we have issued a hotline that we are encouraging residents, if they feel that they are exhibiting some of the symptoms of COVID-19, to call into that hotline, and they are directed to the symptom collector, where they can log their symptoms and be connected to a personal care physician who can further instruct them and either do further screening or connect them to being tested. What we are using that collector for, and this is the last point that I will make, is to arrange data, or to gather data, so that we can find out what the hot spots on our map are in the city, so that we can see if there are certain areas that are disproportionately affected in our city in terms of actual communities, and send resources to address what we are witnessing there. And so all of this is fluid, as I'm sure Mayor Siddiqui can relate to, and is requiring us to be nimble at this moment in time, but also rely on the understanding of mayors across the nation.
Thanks so much, Mayor Siddiqui.
I echo what my colleague just said, and I did want to point out, I have been to Jackson. I have a lot of family in Jackson and Meridian, So, you know, the city is in very good hands. So it's great to hear from you.
Pleasure.
I think similarly, no day is the same, and that's what's challenging. There's no roadmap here, and so you have to remain calm. And for me, that's been what's given me clear direction. You have to rely on experts. You can't do it alone. Myself and the city manager here, we rely on the commissioner of the health department in our city, daily calls with experts to figure out what is actually happening on the ground to inform our decisions as we move forward. And really a focus for me on the most vulnerable in our community. Cambridge is about 110,000, and someone who reads about Cambridge, you hear about MIT, you hear about Harvard, you hear about all the pharmaceutical companies in our city, and it's all what makes Cambridge a great city, and there are huge disparities. We have many people living in poverty. It's so expensive to live here. So these types of issues have been exacerbated as we move through this crisis. And so for me, it's about collaborating among our different sectors and staying focused on our most vulnerable. And so we've done that in a few different ways, and similar to my colleague who's mentioned thinking about who will need the most help here, and thinking about our food programs and our food disparities, and making sure that the children who, you know, were on free reduced lunch are getting access to lunch and breakfast daily. We developed a food line that residents can call, and if you are, you know, experiencing food disparity, we'll make sure that you have groceries every week. We know that so many children and families don't have internet at home, so we made a huge push in the first few weeks to deliver hotspots to our identified families who don't have internet access. You know, so the types of things like that, being creative around that has been something that has been my focus. We realized, you know, this is a huge impact on our business community. And so we said, you know, how about we contract with our local businesses to provide meals to our homeless shelters? And so we were able to get that going and make sure we're filling in those gaps. And so similar to my colleague in Jackson, you know, there's things that have been obstacles, right? There hasn't been clear leadership from the top. And so when we decided to close schools, the state followed suit. But a lot of the decisions we made not thinking what the state was doing, but thinking what is best for the residents of Cambridge. And we did collaborate with many cities around us to move forward on that, to be in collaboration, so that if there is a subsector of cities like Boston, Somerville, all moving toward together, that then that pressure would apply from the state. So we closed schools. We were the first to, you know, close our parks and our tennis courts and our basketball courts. We issued temporary guidelines on construction, on eviction, really thinking about the most vulnerable and the most, you know, who's going to be affected by the crises. But yeah, no day is the same. It is very challenging, but I think really thinking about collaboration, thinking about our most vulnerable, remaining calm are three things that I've done to adapt to the moment and think about the most important parts of my leadership right now.
Thank you both for those really insightful initial answers. I think they touch on many of the themes that I'm hoping we'll cover over the next little while. And I wanted to sort of segue into talking about some of those tensions with either state level or federal authorities. This is manifested in everything from conflicts about shelter-in-place orders to coordination around medical supplies to disagreements about construction projects and housing. So Mayor Lumumba, I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit more background regarding your engagement with Governor Reeves to protect, the people and the assets within your community. I know you recently issued a shelter-in-place order and a night-long community curfew. What's the status of sort of any conflict with state-level authorities, and how are you working through that?
So there are a few things that I would say about that. I think what we are witnessing is the politicalization of this moment instead of a focus of the well-being of families and individuals. And yes, you could possibly call it conflict with the governor and I. Maybe the more appropriate phrase is just a lack of communication, right? A lack of true understanding of the direction that we are going in as a city. One of the initial conflicts that arose out of this circumstance for me was, while I was implementing policy, restrictive policy to keep people safe, many of the bedroom communities around the city of Jackson were not doing so. And so our communities are too interconnected for there not to be a uniform policy that applies throughout the state. Every day, Jackson residents travel to and from the cities that are near us. Partly the problem with that deals with other issues of equity and discrimination, such as redlining that has taken place and divestment that leads people from my city into many of these more affluent areas, smaller communities, suburbs. But nonetheless, it has established a culture and a history of people moving back and forth between these places. Furthermore, Jackson has about 40,000 visitors on an average day because we are the state seat and we are the largest population, and we have two major highways that pass through the city of Jackson. We are also more or less a college town. We have 40,000 college students. We have 7 institutions of higher learning in our city. And so all of that amounts to a great concern for the people we serve each and every day. And so it really, when you're talking about, and this is on the federal level or the state level, when you're talking about supply chain issues, administrations across this country are trying to figure out how you provide masks and gloves to workforce to make certain that they are safe, how we administer tests. One of the things that I felt was maybe not the most productive way of administering our drive-through testing process through the state was that we were requiring people to download an app, a C-Spire app, right, in order to schedule their appointment. Well, there are a number of issues with that, right? There are some people that quite honestly don't have, while the grand majority of us have access to phones, and we're blessed to have that as a means of communication. There are those among us who simply don't have that available to them. And so we are boxing them out. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, we are creating barriers for people to have access to healthcare, even if your tests are free. Furthermore, we are limiting a good sector of our population who are less inclined to download an app. Many of our elders, those that are a part of the vulnerable population, as the data has suggested due to this virus, don't have the resource to that. And even in this moment where we have decided that we're going to fund certain initiatives on our own, there still is a failure to communicate so that we can talk about what we're doing and how that works in conjunction with the state of Mississippi. And so it is a revealing moment. And that's what I'll say about that. And I've recognized that I've been long-winded on my answer, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Mayor Siddiqui, I think probably by contrast, Governor Baker in Massachusetts has been, more proactive, but still slower than some leaders would have liked. For example, you joined an effort among local leaders to have the governor issue a shelter-in-place order. You've also imposed certain restrictions on construction projects, which the governor has been reluctant to do so. What tell us a little bit about why you made those choices and what role you see of local leadership with respect to the state at this moment.
Sure. I think that it was, again, as I said earlier, thinking about what is best for the community and what is best for the city. We've kept that in mind in every decision we've made, and the Governor Baker issued a stay-at-home advisory, and I think it shouldn't have been an advisory, and I think we're now, even just as of yesterday, we're pushing on that advisory to change to an order, and I think it's one of those things where we've really had to decide as and talk to other communities around us and collaborate and make sure that others are doing similarly, so it is a little bit easier for us to also manage. And with the construction issue in particular, we have a lot of construction in Cambridge, and we were hearing from a lot of workers who were scared. We support our unions tremendously. Many of us on the city council talk about the voices of our union workers and so forth, who usually will come to the city to testify on a project. And now we're hearing from them about the unsafe conditions that were happening around the city. And it wasn't an easy decision because we do have simply so many projects that are happening. But what made it easier was that guiding principle about this is a public health emergency. And there was a lot of pushback. The state has not followed suit on that. Some of the other bigger cities have stood strong with us, and that has made it very much an issue that I think most folks have been able to get behind. But we've had to issue a lot of guidelines. There have been exceptions that have had to be made. And so that has been evolving, and there's been some growing pains around that. But I think we're a better city for having done it, because it is, again, as I've said earlier, you have to take these strong measures to ensure the safety and health of all our residents. And many of these residents also, many of the union workers, were coming from other cities. And so, there's a lot of issues there too. And so we really wanted to take into account their voices, and then also make these choices, even though there was no leadership from the top dictating. So that's that's some of the conflict that's come up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for those responses. I think one of the themes we're also hearing from your answers is around, ability to reach and connect with the most vulnerable, the most marginalized members of your communities. It seems that, that's the work of municipal government every day, right? In terms of social services and health services and so many other things through the schools, but certainly in the midst of a pandemic, the ability to reach and connect to everybody is so crucial, because it takes reaching everybody to address to address the problem and the challenges. I wanted to sort of segue to immigrant communities in particular, given there are lots of challenges in serving and connecting to immigrant communities, even in the best of times. Certainly under this administration, the actions, the rhetoric, the policies have made that work much, much harder. Mayor Siddiqui, you came to the United States from Pakistan when you were young. Your parents were immigrants as well. I'm curious sort of how that experience has informed your work in public service, and how you think about that specifically in this moment right now.
Sure. I think it's a guiding light for me, my experiences growing up as an immigrant, and my commitment to public service really comes from that experience. And I think around this, during this, now in this crisis, many of the decisions we make, I've had to think, I think through the lens of my mom and dad. Would they have been able to figure this out? So I go back to that example from earlier when we were delivering, our district was delivering Chromebooks and hotspots. We made sure the instructions were in multiple languages. When we're putting signs up around parks that are getting closed, we make sure that's in multiple languages. Making sure everything is accessible. That's key. And I think if we, don't have some of those basics, then we're not being equitable, right? And so for me, it is about really communicating and making sure we rely on many of the great organizations that do, especially the nonprofit community, and partnering with them, because they have access to many members of the immigrant community, and even through our schools, relying on our family liaisons who often speak multiple languages, who know these families. And so, those types of things have been on top of mind through every policy decision that we're making. Is this going to get to the people who need it the most? And it often is immigrant communities whom there are various barriers. And so that's just some of that, thinking about my own experience and thinking about my parents, and really treating these members of the community as, my family, and making sure that they know they have the access that they need.
Mayor Lumumba, you last year issued some pretty strong statements objecting to the presence of ICE raids in and around the community, and you called upon faith institutions, I believe, to serve as sanctuaries if they could, to protect immigrant neighbors. So just could you tell us a little bit more about your perspective, right now in this moment of serving and protecting immigrant residents and their communities?
I think it's important for us to recognize on a very basic level, we all want the same things. We all want, an ability to take care of our family. We all want an ability to ensure their safety, both in terms of physical health and in terms of being protected against all kinds of social ills that are out there. And so whether your family history is one where you arrived on the Mayflower or you joined us in this nation more recently, you deserve the same human rights, the same privileges that those rights that everyone else enjoys, is my basic view. Like I said earlier, or maybe, I don't know if I said it earlier, but I was thinking it, I believe in human rights for human beings. And so I stand on that principle in every way that I possibly can. And so I think it's also a reductive analysis to charge that someone has come here and taken your job. The reality is that if it was your job, no one could take it in the first place. And so we're pointing the finger at a social ill, at a failure in our economic structure, as opposed to really recognizing that there are multinational corporations that are taking advantage of us all, that are seeking to go to new markets and go to other nations to exploit them in their homeland, requiring them to seek safe harbor in a nation like the United States of America. And then we exploit them once they get here. My frame of reference comes beyond just being a mayor. I had the privilege of serving as counsel for MIRA, Mississippi Immigrants' Rights Alliance, prior to becoming mayor of the city of Jackson. And so I know how unique those stories are. I know how many components of people's stories are left out of the narrative as we talk about issues of immigrants in this nation. And so I think it's important that we lift that up. I am grateful that so many faith-based institutions stood up, and also some Greek organizations stood up in that moment in order to provide assistance, not only providing safe harbor, but also collecting resources. It was a very devastating moment to see not only people who were treated as hardened criminals as they were working just to earn a living for their families, being snatched from their workplace as if they were some threat to society or posing some unique harm or danger. But also, we saw children. We saw children who were arriving home from school. And because their mother or father was arrested during these ICE raids, we had to operate on the fly, where we had to instruct bus drivers that if you see a child who gets off the bus and tries to go to the door and they're not receiving any response, we had to pick children up to take them to a place and try to care for them because they had no one in their household. Furthermore, out of the great fear from what was going to take place, even after the federal government decided to release certain members or certain people who had been detained, certain detainees, based on whether or not they were the primary caregiver in their household, that didn't suffice. Not only because of the harm that had already been done, but so many people were afraid to even let them know that they had children, out of fear that their children would be unfairly targeted. And so, we still stand in the gap boldly against the policy that we've seen in this nation as it pertains to immigrants. And one of the things that I inherited, but was one of the efforts of my father when he was on city council prior to him being mayor, is that he authored and supported a anti-racial profiling ordinance. That ordinance in and of itself landed us on the sanctuary city list of the federal government. And so, where we feel that first and foremost, it is already illegal to racially profile, that it is antithetical to the aims of policing in the beginning. Once you alienate communities, taking an ability for them to contact authorities if they feel that they are unfairly threatened and often robbed and exploited in many ways, then they find ways to protect themselves. That is where you see the development of organized criminal institutions, because they are looking to protect themselves, and other things spring off from that. To some extent, while not entirely analogous, we can talk about that in terms of what we're seeing in the Mississippi prison industry, and what's taking place there. But all of these harms have to be addressed, and we really have to look at the soul of our nation and what we are doing to people at this time.
So I want to cover one more question before we open it up and maybe answer some of the questions that have come in online already. And I want to talk about housing with you both, because I think this is an issue that both has immediate and some longer term concerns given economic trajectory. And certainly it's just another way that this crisis has brought to the fore, right, challenges for our communities, because the notion of sheltering in place for weeks on end really highlights the need for housing stability for so much of our population. And so Mayor Siddiqui, I want to start with you. You spent, I think, much of 2019 studying the issue of tenant displacement in the city of Cambridge, and you live in a community where there have been soaring housing costs, where longtime residents are finding it harder and harder to afford the cost of living. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you learned from that analysis and how you think those issues will play out over the next months to come in this crisis.
Sure. Housing stability is a challenge for many, many families. And now during this pandemic, we've seen just how, as people have lost their incomes, have been laid off, and don't have an ability to pay rent. And so we quickly said, we can put in an emergency order that says that a landlord can't evict you, and this applies to commercial tenants as well, but can't physically evict residents. And that's very important because right now, as I've mentioned, many don't have the income coming in. And so as soon as this crisis, as it was peaking, many of us connected with our affordable housing developers, our Cambridge Housing Authority, made sure that to tell them, even before this order was coming to fruition, to say, please do not evict or file evictions against your tenants for non-payment. We'll work with the city on this. And so that ties into the Mayor's Relief Fund that we organized. Much of the money that's being raised will be, disseminated to families who are having a hard time paying rent. And this could continue for many, many months. And so it's one of those things where this will be a challenge. But I think housing stability, making sure people have a roof over their head is my number one priority. It's, I think, many in the city, councilors, many in the city administration, we want to make sure that right now, given the real indication that people could get displaced, how do we come up with policies that will keep them in their homes? And so that work that I did last year, it's talking about how displacement is, many families are very close to displacement. Now it's being just exacerbated by this pandemic. And so how do we come up with ways to keep people in their homes, work with our landlords, work with the management companies, and really work together on some solutions the next few months.
And Mayor Lumumba, I think sort of the similar question to you. I mean, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing right now? How do you think that they're going to play out? And maybe are there any lessons from, a decade ago and the last economic downturn that may be useful in planning for the future?
Yeah, let me start by first commending my colleague for the measures that she has taken. Just earlier this week, I have, instructed our city attorney to see what we can do specifically for those housing developments that the city provides resources to, that we can order them not to evict anyone. And it's a question that I've had them lean on even further in terms of what our power is to restrict here locally evictions, in a normal manner, and it is oppressive. Evictions and issues like that are managed by the county here. And so we're trying to see what our power is to stop that. I have, also commended the work of Mayor Sylvester Turner of Houston, who's been working on this issue, and even has not only tried to take some restrictive measures, but he's also made some recommendations. Oftentimes when people fill out their application for housing, they're required to provide first month's rent and last month's rent. And so he's made the recommendation that we use last month's rent in this moment, that they apply that and release some of the burden on people. But let me say this. I think that this question, along with the series of questions that you've asked thus far, bring me to a certain thought that I had at another event that I was a part of. I had the privilege of being a part of a gathering of mayors where we were at a leadership institute, and we were talking about issues on one occasion about the growing inequity of our world, and we were asked the question, what is leading to that? And ultimately, there were all kinds of suggestions that talked about issues of housing insecurity, talking about innovation versus workforce, minimum wage, the gender gap, and so many other things that are very valuable and noteworthy contributions to the discussion. But I had pause, and I told them, listen, I have a problem based on the premise in which we are attacking this conversation, because we are talking or taking this conversation as if something has gone wrong. And I said, from where I sit, I see a system that is operating in the way in which it was always intended to. That there was no sudden, veering off of the highway into a place where we landed in an inequitable space. The problem is that economists don't study people, and instead of we talk about the success and failure of our communities and our economy based on things like GDP, gross domestic product, as opposed to looking at sustainable development goals. Those sustainable development goals have to be about whether or not people have safe and affordable housing, whether they have access to a clean environment and we're protecting that environment, whether they have access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and that we're not living in food swamps and food deserts like we see here in Jackson, Mississippi. And we operate from a position, we actually live in a world of abundance, but we operate from a place of scarcity. And we choose to do that. Here in Mississippi, when I talk about things like food, we produce, we are one of the largest agricultural states in the entire country. But yet we have too many communities where people can't, within a 3-mile radius of themselves, have access to fresh fruit and vegetables, right? And so these are things that we have to begin to not only adopt policy on, like our administration is attempting to do, but we have to take a comprehensive and a collective approach to it. We believe in collective genius. And so that is why we have formed and developed cooperative institutions and are building cooperative institutions so that we can fill those gaps. So if we see a grocery store, that we can build our own grocery store, that we can not only have a worker-owned cooperative institution where people can look at how they labor, but they also can determine the fruits of their labor. We're also doing that in terms of housing opportunities and development, trying to create, as we deal with the blight elimination program in the city, how we have blight partners that are formed through cooperative lens. So not only are we knocking down dilapidated structures, but the community has some say-so in how we redevelop and provide opportunities for people. Because what we are fundamentally against is gentrification in our community. We feel that gentrification is a war against people, leading people from one state of misery to the next, and also leading into so many housing insecure families. And so these are just some of the things that we're thinking through and working on.
Well, thank you both for all these answers so far. They've been so insightful and yeah, and just give us a lot to think about, both in the immediate and the longer term. We've gotten a few questions so far, and I think we might have time for to answer a couple more questions. So one question from a student is sort of a pathway question. Question is, as a law student, especially in this time, I feel pulled in so many directions. Can you explain a little bit about your decision to seek change as lawyers by running for office? And Mayor Siddiqui, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think for me, as a legal aid attorney, I really loved working with clients one-on-one, and I also felt that I wanted to contribute in a way that had an impact on a wider subset of the community. And I said to myself, I think I really could use these skills with my clients that I'm using and apply them to the constituent work that inherently is done as an elected official, and also fill kind of my appetite for policy as well. And so I felt that those two things would, really be a good segue into running for office and so forth. And I had wanted to run for office since I was in high school, after I did a lot of work through that youth council, and I went to City Hall and I saw some of the city councilors talking about issues, and I said to myself, one day I want to get to where they are. I didn't know how necessarily, and I used kind of the guiding principles of my commitment to public service, my passion for working one-on-one with people, and my interest in policy to really guide the way and influence my decision to run for office and be in office.
Thank you. Mayor Lumumba?
My path was slightly less expected. In fact, my father, who first and foremost, I had the rare opportunity to live in the household with my hero. Both of my parents, who were community activists and gave their lives to it, in fact, moved us to Mississippi, not because we had family members here. In fact, I have no blood relatives outside of my immediate family now that live in Mississippi. But my father had the opportunity to come to Mississippi in the 70s to be a part of the human rights movement that was taking place at that time. Later, he went to law school because he had questions as to whether his political aspirations in terms of community advocacy, not in terms of electoral politics, but community advocacy, could be married, his revolutionary views could be married with the practice of law. And out of a confrontation that took place in the 70s with the Jackson police that took advantage of a community organization, waged gunfire on a house that they were in, he saw the path that he could do so. One of my favorite books is the autobiography of Malcolm X. And in that book, Malcolm talks about how he wished as a child, he wanted to be a lawyer. And I said, hey, I want to be the type of lawyer that Malcolm would have been, right? And so, I've looked at it less as the destination, meaning being an attorney or being mayor, less as a destination and more as a means to an end. That end is ultimately to provide or create self-determined communities. How can I be a lawyer and utilize being a lawyer to help contribute to that goal? How can I be mayor and create policy that better enables people to have more control over their destinies? That is the goal. I would just say, in terms of potential law students who are thinking about, what direction they will go in and their pursuits, that it is bigger than the suits you wear, the money you make, the cars you drive. If you are doing it for the right reasons, those things will come. And it's nothing wrong with wanting things in your life, that are beneficial to you. But just make sure that you understand that our talents and our abilities are not ours alone. They are the fruit of our labor as a people, belonging to us as a people, and they must be used accordingly. And so I'll just end with this, that be the principal function or the principal philosophy by which you operate. And Charles Hamilton Houston had it right when he said that lawyers can either be social engineers or they can be parasites, right? That feed off of community and feed off people's circumstance. So really focus on what ideological or what main thing is most important to you, what main principle is most important to you, and pursue your goals based on that being the mission and the destination.
So I think we have 2 more minutes. So we'll do one last question with maybe ending on as uplifting a note as we can. Obviously you're both seeing a lot of challenges and a lot of struggle within your communities, but you're also probably seeing a lot of good in people in the response. So you want to just highlight one thing that you've been seeing in your communities that gives you particular hope that's inspiring you right now, Mayor Siddiqui?
Sure. I think for me, what's been so amazing to see is people coming together the way they have. We've raised over, almost $4 million for this fund. And the individuals who've contributed, the folks who are volunteering, setting up, making homemade masks, just everything. I have a friend who was a Cambridge resident, but was visiting her friend in China, her family in China, and was quarantined. And they just lifted their quarantine over there. She sent over 5,000 masks from China to my office at City Hall, so that our first responders and others, for our first responders. So all these different acts, they give me hope, and there's so much happening every day, and really, it's sure the city and myself, my office is doing all these different things, but the community really is sticking together and doing so much that makes all this work easier.
Thank you. Mayor Lumumba?
Yeah, once again, I'd like to thank my colleague, Mayor Siddiqui, you, Jonathan, and just ACS for having me, period. And I've enjoyed this conversation. I've been most encouraged, like Mayor Siddiqui, seeing, the response of the community, how people have become creative in this moment. We have restaurants that have, redesigned themselves into grocery stores, realizing that resources have been scarce, and providing some of the produce that they were stocking as a restaurant, and now because of the decreased traffic, because of stay at home and all those other things, they found a way not only to not allow that food to spoil, but also provide a service to community. And so I thought that was really, really creative, seeing the restaurant step up in that way. I've had members of the hospitality industry contact me at offering their hotels as a place of safe harbor. We have a local distillery called Cathead Vodka that is here in the city of Jackson. They have redesigned their manufacturing, their production to be a space that creates hand sanitizer. They have started distributing, large drums of hand sanitizer to different points across the city so that people can get free hand sanitizer. And so just seeing people, all of the people that have stepped up to help deliver food through our Jackson Meals Matter program. I think, sometimes what you see in moments of crisis, the first casualty is trust. And to see that people, instead of going that direction, have, band together in order to support one another is encouraging. And it really makes me proud of my city.
Well, thank you both for an hour that flew by with a lot of powerful insights. Many thanks to ACS for convening us all together for this conversation. Many thanks to everybody who contributed questions and joined us this afternoon. And I think on behalf of all of us, to you, Mayor Siddiqui, and you, Mayor Lumumba, we want to say thank you for your leadership and for your ideas and the way that you are continuing to push leaders at the state and the federal level to think bigger, bolder, and more inclusively, so that we can get through this together and emerge on the other side, hopefully more united, and with a more equitable approach for the future. So thank you so much for all that you're doing. We all appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to Peggy for any final notes from ACS.
Everyone, this is Peggy. Thank you again. Again, I can't say it better than you, John, so I'm not going to try to. But we will continue to post events on the 2020 Student Convention website. Again, we have an event next Tuesday and next Thursday, so go on that website for the 2020 Student Convention to register and learn more. And thank you all again, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.